Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midweek Message for this week. Um, some of you have reminded me that it's fun to tell stories, and it is. And it's fun to do things with our hands and our bodies, and it is. It's important. And I think we live in our heads a lot, especially during COVID. So, in an effort to get out of our heads a little bit, I have some ideas for us. One is I'm going to tell you a true story from my childhood, who I told somebody this week. So, but it reminded me that it's a funny story, and sadly, it's a true one. But when I was a kid, I was a really wiggly little kid. I spent most of my school days in elementary school sitting outside the classroom once I finished my work. Because I would want to talk with my friends. I would want to see what other people were doing, and I didn't mean to, but I generally sort of got myself and other people into trouble. So every single report card I ever had said Stephanie talks too much. Stephanie talks during class. But this particular story is about church. When I was a little girl, about 5 years old, I think, I was sitting with my very good friend Veronica in our church. Now, if you can, all right, so imagine our church. Here's the sanctuary where everybody's sitting. There's my dad here. And so this is the pulpit right in the center, of course. Here's the choir on this side, and here's overflow seating that looks just like the choir. My friend Veronica and I were sitting there. And we had discovered during the sermon, which I found very difficult to sit through without moving or talking or, it was difficult to behave at that age. But I was too old at 5 to be in the Sunday school rooms in the nursery. But only just. So it was a tough year. Anyway, I was sitting there and we had discovered, because it was winter, that the heating vents were on, and they were really powerful. So we were sitting right next to the wall, and so we started by letting our arms go up with the air, which was kind of fun. And then I discovered that if I took my bulletin and I started to tear it into little pieces, and Veronica and I realized if we threw it shot up into the air, which was extremely entertaining, and then it would just flutter down like a beautiful little butterfly. So we were busily throwing our little bits of our bulletin into this great stream of hot air. And it suddenly dawned on me that I could not hear my dad's voice anymore. So I turned and I looked. And by then, the whole congregation was laughing. Mom had gone out the sanctuary and was trying to get around to me in time. And my dad just looked at me and he said, "Stephanie, do you remember what we talked about before the service about you behaving yourself?" The whole congregation was just killing themselves laughing. Dad told me later, as an adult, that it was the only time that he had ever just lost the congregation and couldn't figure out why. Like, people were snickering and laughing and outright giggling, and finally somebody took pity on him and pointed behind him, and there I was with Veronica, and we were, and it evidently it did look quite a bit like confetti flying down behind him, just floating down, and it had to be a pretty good scene. So that's my story about not being able to sit still. And to this day, I don't sit still particularly well. If you ask Terry, he will tell you that my favorite chair in any room is the rocking chair, because I can rock. I need to move. I just am a wiggler. I always have been. So for those of us who love to wiggle and find it difficult not to move, I have a book for us, and I am going to be reading portions of it over the next few weeks. Um, it's this wonderful book. Hang on. I got to where I wanted to be, and I just realized, it's called Prayer for People Who Can't Sit Still by William Tenney Britian. And he has he has 10 different ways to pray where you don't have to sit still. So I'm going to read parts of the introduction to you to get you into the mood, and also to remind us that we don't have to live in our heads. We don't have to sit still. And maybe we're not even called to sit still. And for those of us who can't sit still, maybe there are great things to do. Hey, I'll tell you, it's one of the things I love about being your minister is there are all these different things I get to do. I get to do this. I get to come visit you. I can call you on the phone. I I write our sermons, and I do a lot of research. I I don't love the world's longest meetings, I will be the first to tell you, but I'm also the one who probably takes us off on a tangent fairly often too, so it's partly my fault. But I like all the different varied ways that I get to be your minister because a lot of it is just learning to know you guys and love you and then reminding all of us about what God called us to do, which is to love our neighbors as ourselves. So I love that. I love that I don't have to sit all the time in order to be your minister. Matter of fact, I'd be a terrible minister if that's all I ever did. Anyway, here we go. So he starts by saying, "My wife is a contemplative. I watch her pray, and in amazement, I have to wonder how she does it. Her eyes close. Her face gets a serene, contented look on it, and she sits there and sits there and sits there. She doesn't move. She doesn't speak. She just sits there listening and communing with God for hours. Then there's me. I've been a pastor for most of my adult life, and I don't think I've sat still to pray for more than 5 or 10 minutes before something distracts me. I hear a door shut and I'm jolted out of my prayers, and I start to wonder who came home. The distant sound of an airplane flying sets me to fantasizing about vacationing, and whenever I get distracted, I know my prayer time is over. It's difficult, if not impossible, to re-engage. I thought maybe I wasn't spiritual enough. I felt guilty because I didn't think I was disciplined enough, and so my prayer life was mostly short conversations with God throughout the day. A better compromise than quitting prayer altogether. But through it all, I had this yearning to spend extended times with God. It was something I knew I needed, but I didn't have any idea how to bring it to fruition. So I pretty much gave up. And then I met Dr. Heather Daniels. Her husband Terry had come to help plant a new church, and after a few weeks, I met his wife. She sized me up in about 3 minutes and asked me how long I've had ADHD. I blew her off. In my opinion, ADHD was a kid's disease treatable by drugs that chemically lobotomized them. I thought that most ADHD kids were really just the result of bad parenting anyway. Brave to say that. Besides, I surmised they all eventually grew out of it and went on to become librarians and such. I wasn't ADHD. It couldn't be possible. But her comments stuck in my head for over a year. During that time, she gave my wife an article on dealing with adult spouses with ADHD. She explained to me that many adults indeed do have ADHD and that somewhere between 2 to 4% of all adults probably suffer from it. And I began to consider the possibility that I might be one of that 4%. The more I read and the more I learned about the disorder, the more things began to make sense for me. I remembered my dad telling me that I never sat through a whole church service when I was a child. Okay, it wasn't something I remembered, probably because I wasn't traumatized by exasperated parents who tried to make their kids sit still for an hour. Instead, my parents would simply take me out to do something else. Back then, I was just considered a rambunctious little boy who couldn't sit still, which was a key to coming to understand myself. I can't sit still. As I'm writing this, I'm aware that my knees are bouncing back and forth as they always do when I'm sitting still. But I always thought ADHD kids had trouble in school, and I'd been a good student. I made great grades all the way through school. How could I be ADHD all these years and be academically successful? Dr. Heather wondered aloud how much more successful I'd be if I'd been diagnosed and treated as a child. And so I conceded that I probably did have ADHD. It was a difficult concession. But not only did I have all the signs, I realized that there were areas in my life that could use a little help, like my prayer life. That little itch in my spirit was telling me something, but I didn't have a clue as to how to scratch it. No one ever thought to tell me there were ways to pray other than sitting still and letting my mind do the talking. I found that out by accident. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because he talks about ADHD, which is great, but I think we all know about ADHD. So here we go. Hang on. Hang on 1 second, people. Okay. So kinesthetic prayer. Here we go. We're getting to the heart of it. Kinesthetic prayer is praying using more than just your mouth or your mind. It's using your fingers, your hands, and your feet, and sometimes even your whole body. I learned about kinesthetic prayer quite accidentally. My wife was doing research on a religious movement in Georgia, and she invited me to attend with her one afternoon. We drove to a farm south of Atlanta where, according to the press, 25,000 of us gathered to hear a woman bring us a message from the Virgin Mary. We weren't Roman Catholic, but someone gave each of us a rosary. And we sat in the middle of a field with the other pilgrims praying the Our Father prayer over and over. And after an hour or so, I realized that I was staying in touch with the praying. Using the beads on the rosary and counting the prayers had a satisfying tactile sense to it, which is so true. That is so true. And so many other types, denominations other than ours, and other religions use things like that. And it's a great way to pray and to stay with your prayer. Anyway, that's for me. The beads moving through my fingers provided just enough sensory stimulation to keep me focused on praying. It was a revelation that was pretty well lost on me at the time, though. Probably the fact that prayer beads weren't typically associated with non Catholics got in the way of my discovery, and I did not revive the practice in my own life for many years. My breakthrough moment came when I walked a labyrinth about a year after I'd been diagnosed. The ancient practice of labyrinth walking had experienced a revival during the late 90s, and I did some research into the phenomenon. In 2001, I actually constructed the first labyrinth I ever walked because there weren't any available locally. I spent 40 minutes of some of the best prayer time I'd ever experienced as I slowly made my way to the labyrinth's center and back. For the first time in my prayer life, I literally could feel the presence of God for an extended period of time. God was so there. It was amazing. Suddenly, it all came to me. I remembered those prayer beads. I thought about the times I felt close to God when I was writing, and I understood why God seemed to show up when I was busy doing something while I prayed. I was a kinesthetic prayer. This book was written for those who feel the need to get connected with God in prayer but just can't sit still long enough to do it. I'm convinced that prayer is one of the most powerful tools in our arsenal, but one of the most underutilized. Prayer changes things. For one, it changes my heart and enlivens my spirit. For another, whenever I've been in the presence of God, I come away with a sense of well being that is nearly indescribable. And I've seen enough prayers answered that I'm one of the crowd who believes our prayers somehow empower a godly response. But I'm also one of the crowd who believes that if our prayers are going to be effective, we are going to have to spend some time with the divine presence. That is so true. I suspect that most of us would have a lousy relationship with our spouses, our kids, our friends, or our wider families if we only spent the amount of time with them that we spend with God. How can we build a serious relationship with anyone, let alone God, if we spend less than 3 minutes a day with that person? A relationship takes time together. That time doesn't have to be sit still time. Some of the best hours spent with my wife are when we walk together. Why wouldn't that be true of the time with God? So, this book offers 10 different kinesthetic prayers for those who want to get into God's presence but don't have that contemplation gene. In doing research for this book, however, I discovered a side benefit. Many of these kinesthetic prayers work well with children, ADHD or not. In my experience, kids don't sit still any better than I do, so when I took the ideas for kinesthetic prayers to junior camp with kids ages 9 through 12, I was surprised at how much they got out of praying when we exposed them to these tools. In some cases, we saw serious, heartfelt prayers offered with tears and weeping as these children connected with God on perhaps the deepest level they'd ever experienced. It was a moving experience, both for the child and for the camp counselor. So, whether you use this book for your personal prayer life or to introduce kinesthetic prayer to your children, children's ministry, or youth group, or just our wonderful, beloved congregation, my prayer for you is that the experience brings you closer to God than ever before. So, there you go. That is what we're going to do for the next few weeks. We are going to talk about the different ways that we can pray with our bodies, that we can pray without having to sit still. I, like him, was a wiggler. I mean, I used to joke and say I was probably the reason that the medical community made Ritalin. I had one of my music teachers told me Oh, one of my music teachers told me at my wedding that I was the reason he left teaching to become a lawyer because I was such an awful was awful to him. I will show you the thing that my mother used to bribe me, butterscotch lifesavers. Do you know how hard these are to find these days? I still love these. This is the last package I have from the last time I was in the States when I went for my dad's funeral. I love these things, and my mother would bribe me with them to sit still during my dad's sermons. And she would say, "Don't you dare chew that. You suck on that thing." So I'd be furiously sucking on it to try to get another one out of her before the sermon ended. I have a lot of sympathy for people who just don't, it's hard. It's hard to pay attention in that way. Not all of us have the contemplative gene. So we are going to we are going to explore all the different ways that people pray. And there are lots of ways to pray, and they're all good ones. Find your groove, but spend time with God because it makes such a big difference. He had such a great point about that. All right. I'll stop talking until next week and in this together with you as always, Reverend Stephanie signing off.